matters as were identified in the motion convening the closed meeting were heard, discussed, or considered by the board during the closed meeting. Do I have a motion? Moved by Ms. Cohen, seconded by Ms. Karen Keys-Gamarra. All those in favor? And that motion passes. You know, I'm so loud, I don't even know that I need this, but as I'm often told. Yeah. All right. Ms. Omesh has submitted a written request to virtually attend today's work session. All those in favor of Ms. Omesh's virtual attendance, please raise your hand. And that is approved. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It is my pleasure to bring this meeting to order, and we have quite a bit on our agenda today, including the first conversation we have about a proposed calendar put forth by staff. And so I know that they want to present their calendar recommendations, and there is a presentation that they have to do so. Dr. Presidio or Mr. Smith, who is going to be presenting it?
Dr. Brabrand is going to start us off.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Corbett-Sanders, and members of the school board. Thank you for accommodating me today to be virtual with you. I am going to present our calendar recommendation to you and talk a little bit about the calendar process framework that we used. And I'll be doing it and being joined by the three chiefs. As you all know, you asked as part of a follow-on motion to convene the chiefs doing a calendar process. And so they'll be joining in some of the comments in our presentation today, and then we'll be glad to take questions at the end of our presentation. So if we can call up the presentation, and I will walk you all through the very first slide, please. Calendar development, thank you. So we are pleased to bring to you our FY22-23 school year calendar, or excuse me, our 22-23 school year calendar, and tell you a little bit about the process. One of the things we did is we took direction from the board to clearly make process improvements. The school board unanimously passed an amendment last March to establish roles of the staff board and community members, and ultimately who owns the calendar process, and to provide clarity on the criteria and priorities used to establish annual calendars for this coming year, as we're doing now, and for the future, including recognition days for religious and cultural observances. So I want to talk a little bit about some of those enhancements that we have. First of all, the Chief Academic Officer, the Chief Equity Officer, and the Chief Operating Officer, in cooperation with Division Council, the three chiefs led the development of the calendar development process. And we did look at a greater focus on equity to inform calendar development so that students, staff, and the community feel respected, included, and seen. We did have an enhanced community feedback process this year that included a refined survey that was developed for parents and staff, as well as, for the first time, a calendar survey aimed at our students. Working to elevate student voice, we brought in our middle and high school students for their feedback. We also conducted a webinar to collect community feedback as well. We also enhanced our calendar committee process. We had broader stakeholder groups that were invited to participate. Surveys that we did on the calendar were conducted prior to committee meetings so the results could inform the conversation. I do want to be clear, though, that calendar committee group did not look at any particular calendar that we were looking at, and we brought them no calendar to review. The purpose of the committee was to have conversations and discuss their feedback along with the feedback from the surveys. So the committee identified themes. If we could just go back for a moment on that last slide. The committee identified themes from the survey and the webinar, represented their stakeholder groups' priorities, and did coalesce on some top priorities that they recommended to us to inform calendar development. We can go to the next slide. The calendar decision-making criteria is really a multi-factor, multifaceted set of criteria. There is no one piece of criteria that has governed the entire calendar development process. It is a multi-process, multi-factor set of criteria that's really a balancing act that we're working to do to bring you the very best calendar that we can for Fairfax County Public Schools. I want to start with some of the criteria. First of all, we need to look at federal, state, and VDOE, excuse me, VDOE guidance. The division must have a secular reason to establish a holiday. All school divisions must provide 180 days or 990 hours of instruction. And school divisions should establish a calendar committee or a calendar feedback committee with broad representation. I also want to talk a little bit about superintendent priorities. Of course, continuing as I have in my tenure with you, wanting to align all the work we do around our strategic plan goals of caring culture, premier workforce, and really our ongoing commitment to equity for all of our stakeholders. A commitment to continued high quality instruction in our classrooms and our schools. A continued commitment to adequate staffing that's become even more crucial as we have encountered this pandemic and returned to school during this pandemic. Staffing levels have been pinched, and doing everything we can to continue to maintain adequate staffing, keeping our schools open during our school division operations. I'm so proud of everything FCPS has done at the beginning of the year and now as we have faced additional challenges with the variant, to continue to have our schools and classrooms open with staff covering every single one of our classrooms. And so that remains a priority. And then also to have our teachers have opportunities to extend and deepen their learning through targeted additional time for professional development. When we looked at all the pieces for school board input, first of all, school board's top priorities included planning time and professional development for teachers, using data to make decisions about the calendar, as well as childcare and family burdens. Staff goals included increased planning time and professional development as well. They also wanted to look at the length of the school day and the length of breaks, and they wanted to minimize implications for our operational employees. Main goals for families included childcare burdens, continuity in terms of continuity of instruction, and communication of the why around the calendar. Main goals for students included continuity of instruction and learning, and emotional and mental health, getting a chance to take breaks and pauses through the year so that students could catch up and just step away, as we're all trying to do from time to time during this pandemic, to catch our breath and relax and restore our mental and emotional health. And then also for religious and cultural observances, we did get feedback across all of our stakeholder groups that this year's calendar did present some challenges, and that consistency across the division is important in how we observe those days, and the need for some additional resources for religious and cultural observances. I'm now going to turn over this part of the presentation to our Chief Operating Officer, Marty Smith, who then will invite some of the other chiefs in for other parts of the presentation. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Dr. Brabrand. And so I want to move to the next slide, thank you, to talk about some other factors that staff reviewed, one of those being staff absentee data. And you'll note here we've provided the absentee data for the holidays or part of the calendar recommendation. It's important to note that staff data was consistently above the average for that particular day as we did a 5-year look back or 6-year look back with the data. I'll also note that on those days for Rosh Hashanah and 9/10/18 that were below, as well as Rosh Hashanah on the 14th of 2015, those were Mondays, and we often note that staff absences are considerably higher on staff Mondays. And so, again, consistently our data was above the average for that particular day of the week. Next slide. You'll note that student absentee data tells a bit different story, and while it is not as consistent as our staff data, it's important to note for those dates for the 21 school year for Diwali, Rosh Hashanah, and for Yom Kippur, you'll note those averages were above our regular averages for that date. We also note that the school board last year identified days as religious and cultural observances, and that may have had something to do with students taking those days off based on the board's actions. Our next slide shows our comparisons with other jurisdictions. As Dr. Brabrand shared earlier, our focus on the calendar development process looked at many different factors. And one of those factors was really, that came from feedback from our calendar committee and the community, was to look to see what other jurisdictions were doing. And you'll note that our 5 neighboring jurisdictions for the holidays that we've recommended have either a teacher workday or have created a holiday for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Diwali. And later in the presentation, Dr. King will note the comparisons to Fairfax County Public Schools in the recommended calendar. Yet another piece of data, or many data points that we used, were focused on survey results. As Dr. Brabrand shared earlier, this was the first year that we have shared an extended survey with our community to include students to get feedback on the calendar and calendar development process. You'll note that we had some mixed returns in terms of satisfaction with the current calendar. Our employees and families were somewhat satisfied with this year's current calendar, while our students were somewhat happy with the current year's calendar. At the start of school, our employees and students preferred that we start the school year 2 weeks prior to Labor Day, while our families preferred starting 1 week before Labor Day. In terms of breaks, you'll note, and it's been this way for quite some time since we instituted 2-week winter breaks, that our students, families, and employees all preferred long winter and spring breaks. In terms of the timing of spring break, we did see a bit of mixed information there, where employees thought that spring break should rotate to match the timing of Easter, which is what we see in our neighboring jurisdictions. Our parents felt, though, that spring break should be a fixed week, and our students were evenly split between the two. In terms of alignment with our neighboring counties, our employees thought that the calendar alignment was extremely important, and as staff, we took that into consideration as we thought about making a recommendation to the board, especially given the timing of some of our issues around staff absences as we were working through the pandemic. Our families thought that calendar alignment was extremely unimportant, and our students thought that alignment was somewhat important. And lastly, for teacher work days, our employees and families preferred that those work days be 2 full days, which would be designated a student holiday. And a lot of the conversations around that were, if we were to provide additional time, would that be best as either full days and or what parents currently know is some early release days that we provide for professional development. And I'm going to turn the presentation over to Dr. Presidio to talk a bit about the Calendar Feedback Committee input.
All right, well, thank you very much, Marty. And on the next slide here, you can see that we had a very broad representation of stakeholders that were part of the calendar committee. So obviously our employee groups, principals, teacher leaders, support employees, folks from our departments, folks from our region offices, but more importantly, folks from our community. Parents obviously were represented on this, but community partners, and a wide representation of a variety of religious faith community leaders were represented on the committee. So we really appreciate the time and effort that the committee members put into the process. They worked very diligently to give us their recommendations. And as we go to the next slide, I want to share what some of their input was. You know, first, as I mentioned, they spent a lot of time reviewing the information, the multiple data sets that we provided to them that included the staff and the student attendance data that Marty shared with you, the survey data that was very extensive, tens of thousands of survey respondents, and the qualitative data that we received through our community engagement process. So the committee worked really hard to look at a wide variety of data sets, and after really careful consideration of all of that information, they made several recommendations that we've tried to incorporate into the proposed calendar. And first, you can see here that the committee's really #1 priority was the recognition of religious and cultural observance days in the calendar. So specifically in our calendar, which we'll look at in just a few moments here, we've included Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, Diwali, and Eid. Eid, of course, does fall on a Sunday, and that's noted on the calendar. The other days are all recognized in our proposed calendar. Additionally, the committee prioritized the need for FCPS to align our calendar to that of surrounding school divisions. And then finally, the committee really emphasized the need for quality and extensive professional development and planning time. We all know how much our schools are really working on right now with academic recovery, social emotional wellness needs, the equitable access to literacy work that we're doing in our schools, and there was a recognition across the committee members that we need to have adequate professional development time in the calendar. So the committee really prioritized, additionally, I would say, as we think about the calendar, the committee also really prioritized mitigating any impact of additional days off in the calendar on support employees. And we've taken that into consideration with the calendar that you'll see in just a second. So I just want to quickly reiterate the decision-making criteria before we look at the calendar. Again, as Dr. Brabrand has already mentioned, there was no single criterion that was used in the development of this calendar. Rather, multiple criteria were used. We started, of course, again with the federal and the state guidelines, as well as the board and superintendent priorities, and we considered multiple data points that included staff and student attendance rates, survey data, and again, that qualitative data that we received through the community engagement process. And then finally, we considered, of course, the impact of surrounding school divisions' calendars on our operations. As you know, we have over 30% of our employees in FCPS who live outside of Fairfax County, and we do need to take a look at surrounding jurisdictions' calendars when we think about impact on our own operations. So all of these criteria were considered holistically, and they were used to develop the proposed calendar that we're happy to share with you now. And as we bring that up on the screen, just a few highlights that I want to point out. Again, obviously, this is our recommended draft calendar. It does have 180 instructional days in it. There are 14 professional work days in the calendar, again, in recognition of that need to make sure that our staff have time for their professional development and professional work responsibilities. The calendar does align spring break with other jurisdictions. And we have some new observances in the calendar. Rosh Hashanah is a professional work day. Yom Kippur is a holiday. Diwali is a holiday. And then Eid is recognized on our calendar, but again, it does fall on a non-school day on a Sunday. The employee contract links here are unchanged. And again, that was a committee priority and a board priority as well to make sure that there wasn't any negative impact on employees' calendars and contracts. One thing I want to point out about the new observances that I think is important as we look at this calendar, there's actually 3 different ways that we're recognizing religious and cultural observances on this calendar. The first is as a holiday, and again, you see, again, of course, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Diwali all recognized as holidays. The second is as a professional work day, where we've recognized the opportunity. It's a non-school day for students, so staff would have the opportunity to recognize and celebrate a religious and cultural observance if it falls on a professional work day. And then the third is an O day. And we have 5 O days in this calendar, which is significantly less than we have in our current school year calendar. Those 5 O days are Dia de los Muertos, Bodhi Day, Three Kings, Epiphany Day, Orthodox Epiphany, and then the first day of Ramadan. And those O days, we had a lot of discussion as a committee, and the recommendation that we're proposing here is that those O days continue to be recognized on the calendar, but we do allow new instruction to occur on those O days. So students who might choose to recognize a religious or cultural observance on one of those O days would have the ability to do that. There would not be any tests or quizzes given on that day, but there would be new instruction, and students, of course, would have an opportunity to make up for that lost instruction, just like they would if they were absent for an illness. So this gives us the ability to continue with instructional continuity, which our current schedule and calendar is a challenge with this particular school year. So those are the major points that we wanted to point out on the draft calendar, and I think I'm going to turn it over next to Dr. Nardis King.
And I just want to, summarize and share what my colleagues shared today along with our superintendent. that this process was not one that was taken in isolation. We aligned with our strategic plan goals of a caring culture and a premier workforce. We kept equity at the center of our decision-making. We established and followed a defined process that the school board asked us to do, staff, parents, students, and community input. We established critical data points as factors for our decision-making. And, we addressed as many concerns as possible, right, while balancing our priorities. We took into account a lot of things were brought forward to us, and we made the decisions that we thought were in the best interest of our students and their learning. Next slide. So as you can see, I just wanted to share with you, like Marty said, that we added Fairfax County here to compare where we stood with our partner jurisdictions. And this was not the driving force, but again, it was another piece of the puzzle to ensure that we were able to operationalize our district based on holidays of our surrounding jurisdictions as well. Dr. Braybrown?
Thank you, Dr. King, and thank you, Dr. Presidio and Mr. Smith. Again, I want to really appreciate the chiefs for all the work they did to shepherd this through per the school board's follow-on motion last spring. Moving forward, we do need to continue to address the challenge of increased planning time to optimize our instructional impact, and we're going to continue to look at that, particularly at our elementary school. I do have in the budget that I shared last week the opportunity to have 3 additional professional development days for our staff at the beginning of their contracts, and we'll be talking about that in the weeks ahead. This wouldn't impact the calendar for our students and families, but it would give 3 additional professional development or PW days for our staff, and we'll be talking about that in the budget process. Just a reminder, as Dr. Presidio said, around religious and cultural observances, we would continue on those O days to prohibit tests, quizzes, and tryouts that cannot be rescheduled, as well as sporting events. We would make a revision to Regulation 22-34 to allow new instruction to take place, to continue forward with some of that feedback around continuity of instruction. And teachers would be required to post new materials to the learning management system, as they are asked to do now. So my recommendation as superintendent is to maintain the current criteria that we brought you, this multi-factor, multifaceted approach, as you develop future years' calendars. I will not be bringing you another calendar recommendation again. This is my last one, just as it was the last budget I presented to you last week. But I do think in the very, very challenging process to come up with a calendar that meets all stakeholders' needs across a variety of different stakeholders, this is a framework that works for our community and our school system. I would encourage the board to conduct this holistic review with the engagement process every 3 years. There are so many things in this moment of unprecedented moment, really, of us encountering the pandemic, that I think the calendar process we've developed is one that can be reviewed every 3 years as opposed to every year, so that this board and staff can continue to be aligned with some of your top priorities that I know we're all eager to continue to try to move forward on, but we've continued to face some challenges related to the pandemic that's prevented us from moving forward. And I simply want to wrap up with being able to take your questions and get any comments, but I want to say to you, as I sit in a space today, as we've finished this long weekend, Martin Luther King weekend, and I just look at all of the division around our country, division around our Commonwealth, division in our community, I think we all need to continue to figure out how we can come together. I accept responsibility for a calendar process last year that was divisive and that hurt. And I accept responsibility this year for a calendar process that I think was enhanced and I think moves us along the journey, an uneven journey, an imperfect journey, but a journey nevertheless that we have taken, that other jurisdictions across this country have taken, across this Commonwealth have taken, and right here, even in our own backyard, a journey that brings us toward greater inclusivity and greater equity in our world. We need to come together more than ever around so many things, And in that spirit, I bring you our proposed calendar for the 22-23 school year. Staff will be here now and I to take any questions, and we look forward to our discussion today. Thank you very much.
And if I may, prior to questions, I would like to thank the staff of all of our departments sitting here at the table today, our staff in OPLFE, our staff in ISD and DSS, staff in my office, and staff in our Human Resources Department. We took this challenge, and I will say it was a challenge, very seriously, because as we were attempting to do all the work that we were doing to ensure that we were open for school, we also understood the importance of the calendar development process, and felt that by pulling in our stakeholders and putting this process in place for its first year was very important for us to do. And we wouldn't have been able to do that with the staff members who are not seated at the table today, but who actually, without their help and support, we wouldn't have this recommendation for you today.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Brabrand, Mr. Smith, Dr. Presidio, Dr. King, Dr. Ivy, Mr. McDonald. I know that you all have put a lot of effort into preparing this presentation, and I look forward to a robust discussion. We do have, so far, 3 board members that would like to speak. I'm going to start with Laura Jane Cohen, followed by Carl Frisch, and then Riccardi Anderson.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you. I know this was a big lift, and I have heard lots and lots of feedback from the community. People did feel like the outreach was much more intentional this year than it has ever been. So thank you for that. I know the work is not done. We can always, improve things. And I think with Dr. King at the helm, our equity work is not done. This is not the end of how we fix some of the disillusion and lack of inclusion that groups feel. It's not going to be healed by this calendar, so I don't want us to set ourselves up for that. But what I do want to say is there were a couple, the number 1 and 2 complaints that I heard about last year's calendar, this current year's calendar, were complaints from staff that it didn't align with the work days. Not surprisingly, if their kids are off school, they would like to be with them. Totally understandable, something we want to encourage, certainly in a caring community. And then the other thing from principals, teachers, parents, students, it's just the O days just did not work well. And so I think everybody worked so hard on that calendar last year. I know that there was a lot of hurt and frustration, but I do appreciate that it wasn't just because we were in crisis, like just double down on what didn't work. I appreciate that you guys took that in and said, all right, we tried O days. They didn't work quite the way we want to. We're going to tweak. We're going to see where we need to. And I think this calendar is really reflective of that. A few things I just wanted to highlight. One, for all of our support staff, this calendar does not decrease their number of paid days. Is that right?
That is correct.
Perfect. Then for professional workday, where we have Rosh Hashanah as a professional workday, I just want to ensure that's not required professional development and that it can't be denied by a supervisor.
Yes, you're correct.
All right. Another one to me is the night before has got to be flagged for the religions where that starts. So I think there was a lot of confusion this year on back to school nights, on various things that people said, oh my gosh, well, I didn't know the night before wasn't on here to show me. I also would say that on the weekend where we have Eid this year is on a weekend. It's probably worth at least noting on the calendar, because my concern is that principals, as we do prom, as we do any of these things, when like Rosh Hashanah next year will be on a weekend. So that's great, but then let's make sure that that night before, when Rosh Hashanah actually starts, that it doesn't get trampled on.
Yeah, thanks for that. We definitely can do that. And Mr. Frisch actually emailed us a reminder to do that as well. So we appreciate that from both of you.
And we can work very closely with the regents and the principals and be much more intentional and specific in our directions and additional information that we put out.
Perfect. And I just want to make sure, I know Dr. Brabrand highlighted sporting events, but I just want to make sure plays, concerts, prom, back to school nights, homecoming, all of those would be included.
That's correct.
Awesome.
That's correct. And Mr. Greenfelder's sitting here today and has heard that specifically from you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think, the other thing Carl had mentioned in our 2x2 is the idea of like even being able to half divide a day. Like there's probably just a good way that you guys can figure out much better than us of how to make a real hard visual for that. Thank you.
Mr. Frisch.
Thank you. First, I want to thank Dr. Brabrand for acknowledging the difficulty around the last process. I think the follow-on motion was a acknowledgement by this board, I think, that the process needed to be better in the year ahead, and I think it was. I've heard a great deal of input from people involved in the process, stakeholders, et cetera, who appreciated the deliberate nature in which we conducted the calendar conversation this year. And I think I very much appreciate the notion that we should be setting calendars for more than 1 year at a time. So I look forward to that being part of our conversation here as well. To pick up on some of the points that Ms. Cohen raised, as I indicated in our 2x2 and in an email today, one way that we can make sure that the calendar visually represents the observations the evening before is by kind of putting a diagonal line through the calendar, coloring the bottom half orange, like it is with the other observance days. I think that would do a good job, and obviously staff should be notified that as a reminder. I also appreciate the updated legal guidance we received from council, that this calendar approach is in line with any kind of applicable laws that we might be concerned with, as we had many concerns last year. So I appreciate that those things are lining up this year. And just to underscore one thing that Ms. Cohen said, for any support professionals who are having, deja vu all over again, this calendar does not have any reduction in days for work for our personnel. And if the budget is passed, and Dr. Brabrand, correct me if I'm wrong, if your budget recommendations come to fruition and are approved, not only will this calendar not result in a reduction in paid days for support professionals, but it would result in an increase in paid days for support professionals. Is that right?
That is correct, Mr. Frisch. Thank you.
And with that, I would like to go back, but I very much appreciate it, and I know that my colleagues have lots of questions as well. Thank you.
So now I have Dr. Anderson, followed by Ms. Marin.
Thank you. Thank you for this work. I do want to start by identifying that I'm very grateful that this calendar does not add the burden to our support staff. So that is something that I'm glad to see. But I did have a question about their work schedule. Is their school year lengthened? Their work year lengthened? Because I know one of the things that was raised to us quite a bit was their opportunity to secure summer employment, and how last year's calendar impacted that, or rather some of the versions from last year. So I just want to make sure that I have a sense of what is the impact of this calendar on their possible employment opportunities for summer.
Dr. Anderson, I can address that question. So the number of work days remains 180, but to your point, there is a slight expansion in the span of days that are covered under this work schedule. So within the calendar, there is 5 additional days compared with last year in terms of the span between the first day of student attendance and the last day of student attendance. So
Okay.
that does impact when our operational employees will be working.
Okay, so that's an additional week. Thank you. If we could go to slide 14. One of the things that I know some of our community members shared with us last year quite a bit is, how is it that you're coming up to these decisions about these holidays? So my next set of questions kind of speak to that, because I don't want for our decisions to come across as arbitrary or capricious in any way. that it's routed in some decision-making criteria. You've highlighted these 8 factors. I'm assuming these 8 factors are not all equal in terms of how they were evaluated by you. So can I get some more details in terms of, I know you said holistic, Dr. Presidio, but what supersedes what here? What has a little bit more weight?
Yeah, there's not a formula for weighting the different criteria. It really is looking at them in conjunction with each other and taking them into, consideration with respect to each other. One alternative approach would be, you have one decision-making criteria point like, absenteeism data. That is not the route that we took. That was one factor that we looked at along with other data factors, and tried to figure out, what was the right balance across those multiple criteria.
And I would add that calendar development is really more of an art than a science. And so as Dr. Presidio says, there's no formula that we used, but really looking at what drives the conversation. And so the priorities from the board clearly drove the conversation. The superintendent's priorities clearly drove the conversation. And then our feedback and input from our stakeholders clearly gave us the foundation for, if these are all of the things that our stakeholders want us to do, then let's look at federal guidance. Let's look at staff absentee data. Let's look at all the other pieces to see what surrounding jurisdictions have done to identify themes and see how we can develop a calendar that meets as many of those themes as possible.
Thank you for your answers, but I'll be honest, I'm struggling a little bit. I think I recall from Dr. Braybrand's opening remarks is that the operational impact would be important. I think I'm surprised that that didn't have a higher sense of impact in how you view this. I'm not going to call it a formula, but how you view this. If the operational impact is really essential, why was that not weighed more?
Well, that was included in the board priorities and the superintendent priorities that are represented on that graphic.
Okay, just honestly, I'm struggling with this because, again, we want for this to not come across as arbitrary to our community, that people can take a look at the same data and kind of come close to the same conclusion. And I don't know, I don't have the mechanism to do that with what I'm being told right now. I'd like to go slide 8, please. Slides 8 and 9 speak to staff and student absentee data, but I see it just for the days that have been identified. Where are the other days? Because if we look on the side, we have about, 14 or 15 more.
We've attached that data to the agenda item today, so it's all there. We have the spreadsheets have been attached to show where the absentee data fall for both students and staff.
But in terms of the presentation, I think I would have benefited from a comparison as to what shows up for all of these days. So if I could ask that to be included, I would like with this and to be part of the conversation, because I'd like to get a sense of, oh, is my time up? Oh, sorry, I thought I heard a whisper. I'm feeling like I'm in the dark here a little bit. I would like to have that data kind of next to this data to kind of offer some comparison, because I'm feeling as if now I have to go back and look at that. What I'm trying to land on is, how did we decide on these days? Do they have the most absences? Do they have the least absences? I would just like some additional information, please. I'd like to go back as well, sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Ms. Marin?
Hi, I really appreciate that this process is so much less emotional than it was last year. So thank you, and it's really cool to see all 3 of the chiefs together working on this. I think this is one of those examples of the art and the science, where you try and make database decisions, but there is, there's just a lot to consider. I shared this earlier in a number of ways, but I just wanted to note, I think this does a lot to not codify, but state the approach and the procedures used, and that will serve to inform us in the future. But what I'm just concerned about is those lunar observances, like for the Jewish holidays and for the Muslim holidays, and I guess really all of the non-Christian holidays that will change each year, that won't have the same date. So what I want to understand is, so this year, if we've got a Jewish holiday on, 2 on the weekdays, we've made it so that one's a workday, one's a holiday. What happens if in the future one's on a Saturday and one's on a weekday? Does that Saturday one get observed, or like what's the protocol going to be if we have one of these holidays like Eid is? So like, how are we going to inform people? And I like that a comment to, put it on the calendar so that people know for planning, but just, it looks like we're not going to do it observed like we would with, say, New Year's Day, like has been done. We're not going to bump it to a Friday or a Monday. So like, what's the approach going to be for, deciding, is Rosh Hashanah going to be a holiday in the future at some point? Or is it always going to be, of those two Jewish holidays at the start of the year, one's going to be a work day, one's going to be a holiday? And I'm just looking also at the data from the other divisions, because some of them have both of the holidays, some of them have one as work day. So just talk to like, what's the standard approach going to be? Thank you.
So I would say that the recommendation is that the dates that we've identified are the dates that would be on the calendar, and then moving forward, if those dates would shift, they would be recognized dates within Fairfax County, but they may not fall on a particular day. We have some data that I asked the staff to compile that we can share with the board as well to show where those dates might fall in our out years, and so we can share that information. And then, as Dr. Brabrand shared earlier, that we would have a holistic review in 3 years' time to have another conversation to pull our community groups together to do a survey and look to see what's happening in other jurisdictions. And so having the recommendation for the holidays, for the dates that we put forward in the calendar, making those adjustments as necessary depending on what day of the week they fall, and then coming back to this process in 3 years to see if there's anything that the board would have to do differently.
Okay, yeah, I think, again, just informing the community as much as possible that, there will be adjustments. I love the idea of let's look forward, let's not do this year by year. I also love the idea that Mr. Frisch brought up of, kind of indicating night before observances. I just want to reiterate that my top priority in this calendar is student instruction. So I'm really pleased to see a lot in here about teacher planning time, about professional development for not only our instructors, but also support staff. I think it captures a lot of what we were seeking, and when we align this with the budget, and we're talking about especially moving towards the science of reading and the budgeted professional development, I think this is really quite the package. So I'm really pleased with this, and thank you for all this hard work.
And if I may say, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Mr.
I
Smith.
gave a few shout outs earlier, and I failed to thank our friends in OCCR for the heavy lift that they did with all of our community input and community outreach. And so I thanked so many people, but I was remiss in not thanking our friends in OCCR.
Thank you. Now I have Ms. Keys-Gamarra, but before we go on to Ms. Keys-Gamarra, I did want to address Dr. Anderson's request for the additional data. The two meeting managers actually asked for that data to be presented in slides, and we were told that it was not, they couldn't do it. However, if you refer to a email that was was sent out by Mr. Smith, he does include quite a bit of that data, and it is on the, and the links on the board docs.
And we can certainly pull up the link if the board would like to look at it in its totality, because it is linked to the presentation, and it is attached in the agenda item.
Okay.
Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
All right, thank you. I do appreciate everyone's work, and Dr. Brabrand, we were all trying to improve from last year, and I appreciate that effort. I am puzzled, however, by one of the pages in the presentation. I think it's page 12, and we discussed it. Dr. Presidio listed out the various associations that are represented, which are numerous, which was one of my big concerns last year, because we're a school system. I think we speak over 100 languages. We have a strong military presence. We are quite a diverse community, so having that representation on this committee is absolutely critical. Where I get a little confused is when I look at the email that was sent out by Mr. Smith on Friday, community representatives are far less. And, I won't read it out, but it's maybe, 6 or 7 people. Obviously, more than one, a few of them are from the same community. So can somebody help me understand what happened there? Because what is listed from the meetings is different from what was just presented in the slide.
Yes, and we've also shared that information in the appendix in terms of those who attended, those committee feedback members. But what we did a broad outreach to members of our.
Hold on 1 second. You're saying you had a meeting and you actually heard from certain people. Is that correct?
We had a calendar feedback committee that was comprised of individuals on slide 22 who are actual members of the feedback committee.
Okay.
And so.
But they didn't attend the meeting?
So they attended the meetings. You'll see that there's a slide, the previous slide, and I think that we're on slide 12 now. It shows the members who were invited. And so we did outreach to all of the organizations on slide 12 to ask them to identify an individual or individuals who could serve on the calendar feedback committee. We gave them a couple of weeks to respond to that particular request. For those organizations that didn't follow through, we followed up again with emails asking for members to join our calendar feedback committee. And then you'll note on slide 22, these are the individuals and committees who came forward. And in the email that I shared with staff, it did highlight that we did not receive the full representation from those groups who were invited.
So, okay, I guess that's where I'm struggling a little bit, because when I look at your list, right, that was a part of your presentation here, it looks fabulous, right? And we have, like I said, we've got a community that speaks, I think, over 100 languages. We've got strong military presence. It's all represented there. But what I think you're saying to me is the actual feedback that came back was much more limited.
It wasn't as diverse as the group that was initially invited. So we did have members from a variety of community groups join the feedback committee, but we did not get representation from all of the groups who were invited.
I understand, but I do think we have to have a clear understanding, because, people get upset when we make decisions one way or the other. Not usually, a lot of people aren't satisfied, right? But when I look at that, it looks to me, and I don't want to read people's names out, but it looks to me as though, I see at least two religious communities represented. I don't see a representative, for example, from the Asian community on here. It concerns me if you, and I'm happy to, I don't want to read out the people's, I'm not trying to do that at all. But it does not, that concerns me when I look at the calendar. First of all, the proposal is, as I recall, similar or exactly the same as one of the proposals we had last year. Part of our concern as a board was that we wanted to make sure we had the outreach. When I look at who actually has participated.
Ms. Keys-Gamarra, can I give you a go back? You've run out of time.
I'm looking at it.
No, that's it started over again.
Oh, I was looking at the number. No, it said 2:40 something when she started talking.
Because I was trying to give you a second
How
to
much
finish
time
up.
am I supposed to get?
3 minutes, so I'll put you on a go back, Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
And what I can say in terms of
I'm used to it turning to 3, and then I know I'm done. Okay, go ahead.
in terms of the broad outreach, and so yes, we felt that it was important to identify those members of the community, to ask them to provide input to this particular feedback committee. One of the challenges that we often find as we do any kind of community engagement is ensuring that we can get members of the community to engage in the work. But we felt that Our efforts to invite individuals were noted, and we ended up with those individuals who chose to come to provide that input. We also had other opportunities for members of the community to provide feedback, and so we had a webinar that was well attended. We had, of course, our surveys that went across all of our student and staff populations, and so we felt that we did provide other opportunities. Was it exactly what we wanted? As you can see from those who attended, it wasn't all who were invited, but we felt that given the time constraints that we were under and the direction that we received from the board, that it was important for us to move forward with those individuals who were represented.
I just have to clarify. It was far from what was presented in that slide, and that's part of my concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Keys-Gamarra. We have Ms. McLaughlin, followed by Ms. Tolan.
Thank you. I'll begin by saying that to my colleagues, Ms. Dearnett Koufax and I had our 2x2 with staff on this, and the meeting did not go well. Because as you all know, one of the things I ask over and over again to inform any of our decisions is data. And I will share with everyone here and the public, I'm deeply worried about the lack of intellectual integrity with what's being presented in this draft calendar. The data for absentee on staff and students over the past 6 years, it just simply doesn't support what you've put in front of us. And I do look at even just the beginning slide, if you can pull up, I think it's the first or second slide, that talks about what was going to be our top priorities and how we're going to create our calendars. So if you can just click through till we get to that slide. I hear over and over again that our top priority is educating students. And even in the data charts and in the presentation, which this is more information than we got in our 2x2s, staff kept saying things like we have significant and extreme absences on the dates that we're now putting in here that we're going to have different from years past. And yet, when you look at the numbers, they're not significant or extreme. They don't create an operational impact. It's not 36% of this or that. When you look at the actual numbers, we're seeing a variation of having anywhere from 3 to 6% of our students out on any given time. For the staff, you guys are going to need to bring us the actual denominator, the total number of staff we have employed, and having us then see the total percentage, because you did a great job on the student data column, but it's not there for staff. So, but on average, we'll have staff out anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 people. But all of our data shows over a 5-6 year period, this school system has continued to operate even when we have upwards of 2,000 staff out on any given day. And even in Ramadan, when we had 19,000 students out years ago, we operate. And so the idea that the legal guidance we got 10 months ago, that you cannot recognize religious observances and put them into holidays because we have to maintain a secular calendar, there's nothing here, even this year, when we look at not having certain holidays in our calendar, and our employees came to work and we functioned. So I know I'm going to need a go back, but I would like to just know, Mr. Smith, can you provide us that information on the missing columns of data on staff absences by what's the total number of students, staff we have as your denominator, and then give us that actual percentage then when you look at the absentee to the total number.
And if Mr. Smith, if you can't answer it, I do have Dr. Brabrand's hand up in the back too.
You can go to Dr. Brabrand and I'll take a look at the data in question.
Yeah, I'll let Mr. Smith answer the data question. Thanks, Ms. McLaughlin, and thank you for being candid as you always are, both in our 2x2s and in the meeting today. One thing I would say to you really that we didn't even imagine back when the board passed this motion in March, is that we would return to school with the impact of this pandemic even more significant than I think any of us imagined. Our substitute fill rates traditionally for decades have been over 90%. This year, they're averaging 70%, and now during this Omicron surge, they're as low as 50%. Just in the last 2 weeks, as we returned from winter break, I had to call and empty out all of our central office folks, except the most essential personnel deemed by leadership team members, so that we could cover every classroom. Many of our school divisions around us have gone to a calendar like the calendar we're proposing. We know we're already under staffing stress, and both currently and in the future, with a teacher shortage that is well documented, we don't want to give our staff any signals that we want them to go to another division where their calendar is more in line with their own childcare responsibilities, which was one of the issues for staff. So it is complex. There's no perfect calendar process. I think this process was better than the process we had the year before, and I take responsibility for that process last year. Is this the perfect process? I don't believe there is a perfect. I think this is an enhanced process than what we had last year. And I do think one of the factors we put in is what the other jurisdictions did, and we've shared that transparently. And that is a real factor for me operationally in what I've recommended today. Thank you.
Mr. Smith?
And I can share, Ms. McLaughlin, that we can add the total staff numbers to that chart so the board has a more complete picture of the total staff absences with the denominator.
And the matching percentage.
Yes, of course,
Yep,
of course.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Tolan?
Thank you. Thank you for your work on this. I do appreciate the operational continuity issues that you kind of tackled with this calendar, and that is a big issue for me. Just being out into schools, I've been hearing about how difficult it is to handle all of the O days and fit the instruction in, and all of the events that we're trying to have at our high schools, et cetera. So I do appreciate that work. I do think, even though it showed in the survey that families thought that the linking our days with surrounding jurisdictions was not as important to them, I think that, if we are really open about that operational impact, and if we were going to have more substitute teachers, et cetera, by not linking to local jurisdictions, families would understand a little bit more why that is important to do for them as well. And so I do like the fact that we are very closely matched to the districts around us in this calendar. One of the things I'm hoping, Dr. Presidio, that maybe you could talk to a little bit is instructional continuity, because that, is a big issue. I know I forwarded, an email yesterday from a constituent, a set of teachers, kind of looking at the days, kind of month by month, and, especially for our secondary schools where we've got block scheduling, we've got, alternate days. How is that taken into consideration in looking at, number of holidays per month and, things like that?
Well, you've just kind of uncovered another layer of calendar and schedule complexity, right? And I think, what we've tried to do in this particular calendar first is you framed out, is provide the opportunity for students on those O days, if they choose to recognize that observance, to be able to do so without missing major things like tests, athletic events, tryouts, those types of activities, but still allowing instructional continuity to continue. So new instruction will continue. Students recognizing one of those O days obviously would miss that instruction and would have an opportunity to make it up, just like they would if they were absent for an illness. So that's the major level of instructional continuity that we tried to address in this particular calendar. The number of days on a block schedule, they always balance out over the course of the entire year. They might not balance perfectly within one particular quarter, but over a course of a year, they do balance out. So that is something that we looked at in this calendar, and we don't have any concerns about the impact on a block schedule with the proposed calendar.
All right, thank you. I do want to point out, and I think it's just an oversight, because you did have Lunar New Year on, I think it was slide 8 is your list of holidays. I was a little disappointed, since Karen Keys-Gamara pointed out not to have more input from our Asian community, but I don't see Lunar New Year on the calendar. And it's, I think it should be that first week in February.
I think it's actually occurs on a
Somewhere?
Sunday, the 22nd of January, so that could be another thing that
Oh,
we
I got it.
could note on the calendar when we develop it. But it does occur on a Sunday, not a school day.
I see, but it's not listed. Right, so I just want to make sure that those holidays are all listed, just as we were pointing out earlier, including Easter and Christmas, which somehow did not get listed on the original calendar that we had as well, just for, planning so that we know that we are recognizing all of those holidays.
Ms. Tolan, one thing I think I recognize, I think we actually perhaps posted the wrong version of the calendar to board docs. I think we have one that's perhaps more updated.
Yes, the
Now,
calendar that was posted has those dates listed.
Okay.
You updated it on Thursday, if I
Yes,
remember correctly.
Okay, I think because the one I just pulled down doesn't have that, so if we can just, I guess, double check that the one that we actually have out on board docs has those holidays, because I downloaded this, I think, I hope last night, so anyway.
We can do a double
double
check,
check.
but
All right, thank you. And the only other thing I wanted to mention is hopefully, now that we have, if we get this calendar process down, I have a number of constituents that are begging for us to get the calendar out earlier, for, planning purposes, for families and for our schools. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tolan. Ms. Sizemore-Heiser, followed by Ms. Pekarsky.
Great, thank you. And I'll start by picking up where Ms. Tolan left off. So you're saying that there's a version of the calendar that lists on their Lunar New Year, Eid, Orthodox Good Friday, Christmas, and Easter as holidays. I just want to clarify which ones are listed on there as holidays, even if they fall during a break or during a weekend.
yes, we do have a version of that calendar. I just want to check what's posted, but we do have a version of that calendar.
Can you stop my time? Because it's continuing to going while he was answering, so I lost like 15 seconds there. Just saying, I mean, 3 minutes goes by fast, 15 seconds is a lot of it. Yeah, I have a lot of stuff to ask, so, I'm sorry, I missed the answer. What was?
So it seems that the correct one is in the presentation, but we'll have to get the correct one posted as the attachment. So we, that information, it seems that it didn't get posted as the correct attachment, but it is correct in the presentation. We will get that updated. I'll ask the clerk to take a look at that.
All right, so I don't have to flip pages. Can you just tell me which of those dates are listed in the presentation? I got 33. Well, that's really generous.
Yeah. Can we correct the clock as well? I believe it's like 2 minutes and,
Well, no, it was 2:45 when he started speaking, and it kept going.
So I do think the correct version is on slide 16 in the presentation.
In the presentation itself.
We
yes.
need to update the attachment on board docs where there's the separate calendar. But if you look at slide 16 in the presentation, that's the current version that we have.
And Ms., you asked specifically, yes, Lunar New Year, Easter is listed.
Okay.
What other ones?
On the new observances, since Orthodox Good Friday is listed as a teacher workday, is that going to be listed under the new observances similar to Rosh Hashanah?
And so I think moving forward, the recommendation is that those dates that are recognized in the calendar this year be those dates that are memorialized for the calendar moving forward for at least the next 3 years. And then there would be the opportunity for the board to have another review with a comprehensive community engagement process.
Great, thank you. I wanted to dig into a little bit more the stakeholders that you invited to the community. You did look to invite from your slide a really diverse group of stakeholders, including members of certain Asian communities. Is that correct? And they didn't come for whatever reason. Did they give you any response back?
There was no response back.
I did notice one of the names in your email you sent the names on the stakeholder group. One of the names looked like she might have been somebody from either India or Pakistan, at least from the name background, which is, I think, an Asian community. I just wanted to put that out there. So it wasn't that we didn't have, I just want to make sure anyone who's listening that we did have some representation potentially from the Asian community for our community who might be listening.
Well, and thank you. I don't have a listing of individuals' backgrounds. In terms of major organizations, there may have been some organizations that weren't represented, and it's only because they didn't respond to the email.
Okay, so you did try to be inclusive with that community stakeholder group. I wanted to also dig a little more into secular purpose. I know the slides started talking about we need secular purpose, and you talk about operational challenge for the secular purpose, but I'm wondering also, we have a secular purpose in terms of, in addition to the operational challenge, wanting to fulfill our strategic goals in specific premier workforce? Because I think what I saw from the staff survey data is that staff want to be in alignment with our neighboring jurisdictions for childcare reasons. And I know we as a board have often stated the desire for a diverse workforce. There are studies that show the importance of a diverse workforce and students seeing themselves reflected in their teachers and staff. I'm wondering, maybe Mr. McDonald knows this, what's the recruiting challenge of having our neighboring jurisdictions giving days off that might appeal to a diverse workforce and we not? I'm wondering if that could be an operational or recruiting challenge.
I cannot speak to the legal context, but certainly from an operational standpoint, setting a calendar that honors and recognizes a variety of observances ultimately can only help us in terms of our ability to recruit and attract diverse talent to our organization. I think it signals that we value diversity and ultimately have demonstrated that through the design of our calendar.
Just to add on to that briefly, I think this is another point where surrounding counties and school divisions calendars really matter, because when surrounding school systems are recognizing those days, and if we were to not recognize those days, that puts us at a disadvantage in terms of recruiting.
So I guess I might argue in this day and age with a significant teacher shortage and sub shortage, the operational challenges of both the staff absentee that's listed on here, which is an increase. I see on Diwali, for example, a 19.8% increase over average. Eid is a 43.9% increase. Rosh Hashanah is actually more of a student absentee increase, and Yom Kippur as well. It seems like given today's operating status and the stated goals of One Fairfax, of our strategic plan of recruiting diverse staff, that it's a pretty significant challenge both in recruitment and in operations to not be in alignment with our neighboring jurisdictions. Would that be a fair way to sort of look at it?
I would say that would be a fair way to look at it. As we've discussed with the different factors that we've looked at, and I don't want to put it in this way, but I'm going to, it's that almost as if nothing is more important than any other thing, and yet everything is important. And so as you're looking at those themes that we've identified to drive this calendar development process, there was no one thing that we pointed to. But as you start peeling back layers of the onion, you realize that if you're going to look at neighboring jurisdictions, you're obviously going to have to understand what that impact is on your own operations. If you're going to look at feedback from the community and listen to what our community stakeholders say, to what our school board has as a particular priority, what our superintendent has a priority, you then have to figure out how to put all of that together. And so in this particular process, there was no one driving factor that was more important than another, and yet at the same time, every one of those factors is extremely important and was extremely important for us.
And I appreciate that, and I know there's many balancing acts that go into the calendar. I guess from my perspective, I think the most important thing, the thing that we're all really here for, is educating our students, right? And the successful operation of our school system, having staff, having diverse staff that studies have shown help the diverse student population that we have, to me is the most important factor, right? You know, the community input is obviously very important, and we want to make sure our community has a chance for robust input through the survey and the stakeholder. But, you know, the operational impact to me, I think, is the most important factor. And I
Thank
have
you,
a
Ms.
couple of things- I'll
Sizemore-Heiser.
take it,
You
go
got
back.
more than 3
I
minutes.
did,
You
I
got
did.
substantially more. So if you would like a, go back,
I
you're
don't think I
welcome
got
to it. Go
substantially
back.
more, but I'll be
Yeah,
happy
you
to
did.
go back.
Okay. Ms. Pekarsky.
Okay, I thought it was, oh, anyway, okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate what you said about, you know, this process last year, and it was very divisive and hurtful, and we've got to do whatever we can to ensure that we don't end up in that same place, because it was not a fine moment for us. Having said that, you know, I do understand the argument of the aligning with the other school jurisdictions, and it did in the survey seem to be very important to our staff, and certainly with at least the Easter being misaligned this year, while I think good intentions based on, you know, some sound reasoning. The reality is that some of my schools are seeing some very significant impacts because Sully District is very close. You know, it borders these other jurisdictions that will be taking those days off. So I agree. I think that it just is the reality, and it has to play into the decision. Having said that, you know, I've brought this up several times with you, and I'm having a hard time understanding. When we look at the data, there are a couple days that we are not memorializing that really stand out in not just perceived or potential days of impact, but real impact in the numbers that we've had in the past few years. One is Greek Orthodox Easter, which every 4 years actually falls within that Easter spring break week, but the other 3 years it does not. This year we have it as a professional working day. For me, that would need to be memorialized because the data is there in student absences and in staff absences in a significant way. Another one is Lunar New Year. I know next year it falls on a Sunday, but I think going forward, I do think, because again, the data is there, and the data is not everything, but it's an important piece of the things we do, and it gives us a way to go back to our community and make, you know, arguments that I think, you know, make sense to people. So for me, that would be important. I think Veterans Day is another one that is not on there, so would love to hear, you know, thoughts around all of that. Above all, what I've heard from families in the past year is continuity is important, but because we don't have those pieces of this fixed, unless we do it through amendment, you know, process, I don't know that I would be okay with 3 years without doing a look back and taking some of those into consideration.
Ms. Pekarsky.
I'm over, I know. Thank
So
you.
can I give you a go back?
Sure, I may not need it, but yes.
Okay, thank you. And with that, I will take my turn, and I'm glad to follow Ms. Pekarsky, because there is an expression that if you are not at the table, you are on the table. And when I look at the group others, and when you look at the numbers. And so we need to work on this calendar more to ensure that that has that mutual respect and inclusivity of all in it. And similarly, you know, I look at this is a operations-driven calendar. It is not a calendar that reflects the feedback from the calendar survey, which said I'll read the highlights. Majority of all groups responded they were somewhat or extremely satisfied with the current calendar. Majority of all employees and students were against losing days at winter break, spring break, or the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. However, a majority of all groups were also opposed to lengthening the school year. We're lengthening the school year. We're not observing those that are clearly defined as having observances. So I would like a little bit more feedback on that, because when you look at the calendar committee and then you put up a slide that says, oh, all these groups called for these three, well, those are the three groups represented in that committee.
So I don't know if I have an answer for you, but what I can say is that as staff, we look at these work sessions as an opportunity to bring something before the board so that the board can have a discussion and that we can have a discussion with the board about any recommendations that we bring forward. And so I'm going to tee this up for Dr. Brabrand to possibly weigh in, because I think that there may be some opportunities for us to take this work session and possibly go back to see if there are any things that we can do to bring a recommendation before the board that would help you in your vote as we think about this upcoming vote. So again, specifically, I don't have an answer, because as we invite folks to the table, I don't personally have the ability to go out and force organizations to come to the table, and force perhaps might not be the right word, but what I can say is that we can certainly take the information that you all are sharing with us at this work session to see if there are any ways for us to go back and make any different recommendations about the calendar.
So Dr. Brabrand, you can certainly respond. I would just encourage that in the past, your school board members made appointments.
Well, I'd make a couple of comments. Thank you, Ms. Corbett-Sanders. One thing I'd say is I believe the board should pass this calendar. And I believe as we pass this calendar and we continue a process, whether it's 3 years from now or next year, we will see more people respond to our invitation. We're taking a step in the journey. I mentioned in my remarks at the beginning, it's an imperfect journey. School districts around the country have made this journey. It's not perfect, but it's a journey that we need to take. And I believe more and more of our community will step forward and continue to come forward as they see us do this work. That includes trying to be more inclusive in all that we do as a school division. We'll certainly take the feedback that we've heard from the school board today and look at that. And we also know that school board members often want to make an amendment to a particular day or days. I heard you talk about Veterans Day. I heard Ms. Pekarsky talk about memorializing the days that we have on there. And by the way, Mr. Smith already had said that. The framework we shared with you today would be the framework for the next 3 years. Again, you may not want to wait 3 years, but this would be the framework. But the board would always have the right to come back next year to make adjustments or changes based on operational realities, where we are in the pandemic next year, or any other reality that's not before us today. So thanks again for sharing your comments. And I've enjoyed all of the board feedback today. We did do our best to bring you an enhanced process, and I think we have a better calendar before you as a result. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Brabrand. I see Ms. Omesh's hands up.
Yeah. Should I go ahead?
Yes, Ms. Omesh.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. And, happy to follow some of the discussion around here. I did want to just start off by thanking staff. I think, obviously in light of what happened in the past and the challenges our staff faced this year and our families based on the disconnect compared to our neighboring localities, this is a really tough one. And there's a lot of considerations to keep in mind. So I do appreciate staff bringing forward a working product here. I did just want to, I think in maintaining intellectual integrity, as we look at this, I do think it's also important to recognize that sometimes the quantitative is not available, and that at times I appreciated staff's framing of art, not a science. and we can inch towards it being a science more and more with the years to come. But I think given what we have, the reality is that this may be more of a qualitative and quantitative process rather than just one that's quantitative. I think it's important to recognize that. I did want to ask Mr. Foster, can you just refresh our memory? I know that the legal guidance you had certainly touched on operational challenges, but my recollection is that you actually had recommendations for what did pose significant operational disruption. Can you just remind us about that?
I'm sorry, Ms. Omei, she is not here.
Okay, do we have anyone from the legal team?
I don't know if Mr. Foster is here right now, Ms. Omesh. We may be able to get him down. I know he sent you all both last year and this year his legal analysis, and I'd encourage board members to look at that, and we can make him available. As you know, many of you know, Mr. Foster is very, very busy with all of the events that are going on around us over the last several days on many fronts, including calendar. So we'll see if we can get him down briefly later in this work session.
Mr. Foster is trying to break away, and we'll try to get here.
Okay, thank you. And that's fine. I mean, I don't know if Mr. Smith or even Dr. Braybrand can just touch on that fact. Maybe it can be attached even to be helpful for folks to review, but the memo that we had from last year.
Yes, we have a memo from last year, and Mr. Foster provided updated guidance to the board in the last day or so, and we'll be sure that that's brought back up to the top of the inbox for board members to look at that analysis. Thank you.
Ms. Omesh, for clarification, are you asking for both last year's legal guidance and this year's legal guidance to be provided to the board?
I think it would be helpful to have both. It doesn't hurt. Yeah, and I was referring to last year's mostly, but yeah, and I say that because I think I hear some of the concern folks have around operational impact, even for, I think, the Orthodox holidays, Bodhi Day, Lunar New Year, Veterans Day, et cetera. As folks have pointed out, the absenteeism data seems to suggest action in a certain direction. I think where I find that, this is necessary is also that other localities have made choices that have put us in difficult circumstances. So perhaps that's how the art plays out this year, and we continue to problem solve. I think there remains a question, and I'd love to hear if staff have been able to problem solve it all on this one, but it's still lingering, I guess, is, we are relying on absenteeism data to inform some of this, but that will no longer be available as we take days off. So in prioritizing these, will it just continue to be the art through the committee and outreach, or where do we hope to land in that?
Dr. Presidio?
Well, you have three chiefs here, so it's like who should answer these questions? I think it's a great question, Ms. Omesh. I think, one thing that we could look at in future iterations of this work, if we wanted to, maybe would be more direct survey questions, particularly asking folks about their intent to celebrate particular days. That could be one additional way we could get an additional data point beyond absenteeism data, but definitely a good question, something for our team to consider further.
Do we think that perhaps having more information about our families even in our data collection could serve that need?
Well, I think in terms, we have demographic information about our families, but we don't collect any information about families in terms of their religious affiliation. So I think we'd have to be careful about making any assumptions there. So if we wanted a data point, I think we're limited in what that data point would look like. So absenteeism data, surveys, those are probably the things that come to mind right now, but we could continue to think about that.
Yeah, it's certainly a forward-thinking question. I think, but it is essential for us to plan for. And I would imagine collecting that kind of data, even if it's self-reporting, would be fruitful. And I say that to my colleagues, because I know this has come up quite a few times. The last thing, I know my time here, but I won't take a go back. Ms. Marin elevated the point on the lunar challenges. Where does that put us if, like this year, things change mid-year?
Ms. Omesh,
do we plan to then take days off?
Your time is up.
No, I know. I acknowledge that my time. Yeah, I said that. But if someone could address that, please.
Does somebody want to answer her overflow question? Ladies and gentlemen, it is now 10 after 1. We were supposed to take a break at 1 o'clock. I am going to suggest, with the agreement of the board, that we go until 1:30 on this. And we have every board member wanting to speak. So I understand we did start late. And so what I'm going to suggest is that we limit our go-backs to 1 minute each, or 1.5 minutes each, so 90 seconds, and that gets us to close to 1:30, if you don't mind. And I am also going to ask that people utilize the Next Steps link that Ms. Medea has sent around to the board.
And we will be brief in our responses.
That would be helpful, thank you. So, Ms. Cohen.
So much to say. I think we have to be really careful when we have these conversations, though, because sometimes the unintentional effect is we disincentivize people to participate in these groups, because we just said, hey, this is not as reflective as we'd like it to be, and then we disregard the outcome of those. So I'll just tell you, just personally, I've had 3 people on the calendar committee message. It may not be intentional, Ms. McLaughlin, I'm just saying that's the... My apologies.
Could we give seconds back, please?
Is that I think we're losing the perfect, losing the good for the perfect. And so some people felt like what we have said suggests that they're not a part of different affinity groups, like if we're just looking at their last name and deciding what category they belong in. And that's how people have unintentionally, I'm sure, taken some of the comments that we've made this morning. So I just want to say, when we talk about other groups not being identified, when you look at these groups, there are military spouses, there are Asians, there are Jews, there are Christians, there are non-practicing. I mean, we forget the intersectionality that comes with these groups. So I just wanted to say also, we're not putting in the comments, people said things that were not didn't make any sense together, right? On the survey, some people said, I don't want the school year to go longer, but I don't want Christmas impacted, but I want those days to be included. So, I mean, we can draw conclusions. The comments overwhelmingly were that they wanted a calendar that was more inclusive. So I just think we as the deciding body, all of us have to take in our input from all of our constituents and vote in the best way forward.
Thank you, Ms. Cohen. Mr. Frisch.
Thank you. I've very much appreciated the conversation, and I think we're going to have more of these, if not, certainly one-on-ones with each other as we kind of figure out the path forward here, whether this is going to be for the year or for 3 years or some changes to it, whatever it ends up being, we're going to have those conversations. I do want to note that what's being recommended today is markedly different than what was brought to this board last year, both in the recommended days for holiday observances and in the way that the calendar was prepared, the process, the updated legal guidance, and how the days would be recognized, if they were recognized at all. So that is markedly different than what was initially brought to us last February. All of that is. There are some similarities to motions that were made last year and failed, but even that was for different days than are currently recommended in this calendar. Some different days, I should say. So as we continue these conversations, I'm hopeful that we can find some consensus as we all kind of come to the table with a spirit of compromise. One question I do have is, if other days were to be added to the calendar, let's say a Lunar New Year or something else, how difficult would it be for...
Mr. Frisch, be very quick because you're already past your time.
Okay, I can take 3 seconds. For making that a teacher work day, similar to how we've recognized a different day.
So
With-
in adding additional days to the calendar, if we create a holiday, then we have to create a student day. And if you add a teacher workday, it does throw off the contract lengths for individuals. And so we have to be very cognizant about the fact of moving holidays within the calendar or adding holidays, because for every blue on the calendar, if we pull it up, for every blue holiday that we add, we have to add a yellow day in its place. If we are switching or moving those blue days with a teacher workday, we would then add an additional teacher workday. But if you add a blue day, you have to add a yellow day corresponding. Now, there are opportunities. We did get feedback that those long breaks were important, but we do know that there are opportunities for us to look at our full two-week winter breaks to see if there are ways that we could possibly reduce those days to add other days to the calendar. But that's where it is a science of having a set number of days for staff, a set number of days for students, and only so many days in a particular year.
But a professional workday wouldn't require a change.
Mr. Frisch.
I'm just trying to get the answer to the question I asked.
Okay,
I asked about professional workdays. I was given an answer about
I'm going to go to the
holidays.
next person, okay? They should answer the question, but yes.
The question was about professional workdays versus not holidays.
If you add a professional workday for staff, you would have to then adjust the contract because you're adding an additional workday for staff.
I'm sorry, I don't know. There's a breakdown in communication. If you are changing a day that is a yellow day to a professional workday, there's no change to the contract, correct?
There is no change to the contract, but then you have to find a day for students on the other end.
The issue is the number
Gotcha.
of days or the number of hours
Okay.
in the year. And
I
so
got
the
it.
second part is the hours. Okay,
Can I just
Dr.
add-
Anderson.
Just in full disclosure, so the board has all the information, and I don't mean to overly complicate this, but for future discussion, there is the opportunity to not have a 180-day calendar, but to go to the 990 hours of instruction. We've always defaulted to a 180-day calendar because that gives us the ability, when there's a snow day, to divert to the 990 hours without having to add days at the end of the calendar. But there are other jurisdictions, even in Northern Virginia, that start with less than a 180-day calendar.
Thank you, Dr. Presidio. Dr. Anderson?
Thank you. I appreciate all the discussions, particularly the comments that Abrar made, and you, Karen, and Ms. Keys-Gamarra, and Stella. I'm really struggling to figure out how we have come to this decision. And the only thing in terms of these days, and what I think I heard, Dr. Brabrand, and correct me if I'm wrong, is we've landed on these holidays because that's what our neighbors are doing. Please stop my time. I asked a question. I get 2 more seconds. I had stopped.
Dr. Anderson, it was certainly one of the factors. It is certainly one of the factors. It is.
So if our surrounding jurisdictions took all 16 days, made them all holidays, we would follow suit?
I don't know. I think we'd have to figure that out. And I think we'd have to see where we are in this pandemic. If we're in the pandemic the same way operationally that we are now.
So I go
We
back-
are operationally hanging by a much more thinner margin than we ever have before. A drop of 20 points subs, staff members who are hearing about this great resignation across the country for teachers. We don't need to give our staff any other reason to leave FCPS to be on a calendar that aligns with their own child's calendar. So again, there is no perfect calendar. I have no perfect calendar to the board. I have a better calendar process this year, I believe. And I have a calendar that I think I hear consensus by the majority of the board to support. If there are amendments to the calendar to change a day or to memorialize, even though I said this framework we gave you, my recommendation would be to memorialize this framework for the next 3 years. But if there's an amendment on Veterans Day or a particular day that you're wanting to be sure about, I feel like with an amendment, perhaps we could get even more of the board together in consensus. But I've heard more positive feedback than negative today. And I think it's taking a step forward that's imperfect, but is the right step for our community and school system.
And perhaps what you're hearing from the board is correct, but I'm not there with you because I struggle to figure out the threshold of our decision-making. I don't know how we came to these decisions outside of now, what I think I'm hearing from you is of those 8 factors, the most important was what our neighbors are doing. It's not what our parents have said per the data that Karen just shared. It's not us having some sort of threshold so that we have all of this data that we've collected, but I don't understand how it's been molded and presented in this decision because I'm hearing it's holistic. It's got to be a little bit more detailed than that. I'm really struggling, Dr. Brabrand, to understand how we arrived to these holidays outside of the fact this is what our neighbors did. I don't get a sense of what our goals are. I don't understand. There's so much here I don't understand, and I've just run out of time to ask my questions. I don't see us inching towards that intellectual integrity that that Ms. Omesh mentioned, and I think somebody else talked about.
Dr. Anderson.
Thank you.
Yep, I would just say it was a multi-factor process, as I shared at the beginning of the presentation. There wasn't a formula, it wasn't weighted. And if that's something the board wants to do in the future, it's certainly something we could look at. I honestly, again, I've shared what I've shared. Our staff did our best work, and we think this is the best calendar for the board to adopt moving forward. And you ultimately will decide what the best calendar is for FCPS. In my heart, in my soul, and in my belief of where we are in this moment in time, in this country, this Commonwealth, and in FCPS, operationally and instructionally, I believe this is the best calendar.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Brabrand. We're going to go on to Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
Thank you. I do want to clarify because asking questions in my business is not negative. It's what we do. And the reason I was asking those questions, from my assessment of looking at the actual list, I can identify 3 different groups, even including what Ms. Sizemore-Heiser said. So that's different than what we presented to the community. And I do think that we have to be, there's a difference between saying we gave outreach to these groups and we actually were able to get input from a particular groups. And we didn't make that distinction, and I wanted to make sure that the community understood that. The next thing that I want to make sure we address is that we describe for the public what's happening next. What are the considerations? Part of the ongoing motions from last year had to do with what is the legal guidance? What are those considerations? What will our outreach look like? And how can the public participate? That's the level of transparency I'm looking for, and I am certainly willing to make a motion to include at least Veterans Day. We have a significant military presence in Fairfax County, and every year we get a little bit beat over the head by them because we don't have that day off. We tried to balance it out with some celebrations. So I would love to hear, Dr. Brabrand, of any proposals where we might be able to accommodate some of those other days mentioned by Ms. Stella Pekarsky. I'm done. Thank you.
We are absolutely open to an amendment around Veterans Day. I certainly heard that from several board members. We are very open around that and could look at whether that would be another instructional day or a teacher work day. And we could make some changes to be able to preserve a 180-day calendar and make a Veterans Day different than its current designation. So we welcome that feedback from the board for moving forward in direction when we have this before you for a vote in 2 weeks. The good news is we have a little bit of time to get your feedback and direction, but we could absolutely do something around Veterans Day. We can absolutely do something around memorializing the days that we put on there, which I think we clearly said, but if there's a need for clarity on that, we can do that as well. Thanks.
Yeah, can you all hear me when I speak? Oh, okay, because it's really important. We're just running short of time to keep all of our comments, even from staff, at within the framework of a minute and a half. So, Ms. McLaughlin, please.
Dr. Anderson, thank you for echoing my concerns about intellectual integrity on this. That I was the other person you were thinking about. I really would like to have staff answer quickly. How is it that you look at the data to inform the impact we have on our staff alone on Veterans Day, where surrounding jurisdictions have it as a holiday, why, since it surpasses the other holidays that you want incorporated into this calendar, you didn't put Veterans Day in there? Because it fulfills every criteria you've said, so why isn't it there when it's far higher than any of the holidays that you want to embed in this calendar?
So I'll take a comment on that and let the chiefs add. We've had this Veterans Day debate, as you know, Ms. McLaughlin, multiple times by the board over the years. And the Veterans Day agreement that this community has had is to make it an early release day so that there can be observances done in school for some folks that are not connected. And I see you nodding in disagreement, and I just have an opinion, which I'm sharing, as you and I have talked about, just sometimes agreeing to disagree. And I want to be absolutely clear. If this board wants to do something with Veterans Day, staff awaits an amendment and a recommendation, and we can follow up and make that. But again, traditionally in my 30 years, Veterans Day was an early release more often than not. It was debated sometimes about being a day off, and it never passed. Glad to consider it for this coming calendar. Thank you.
So I unfortunately didn't get an answer, because what I said was, if your litmus test is operational impact of staff needing to be absent because they live in another jurisdiction, it affects them being able to come to work, that, and then also that you want to attract people based on how we show our respect for our diverse community. Our military community is one of those affinity groups. In other words, for some reason, you all ignored what the Veterans Day data showed us, and it should have been included, which is why I'm looking at this exercise alone. And I think we have a massive Pandora box problem, because there's going to be a whole lot more holidays that are higher than the ones we have, and they're going to come up on a weekday and not a weekend. And I guess I would just say, Ms. Corbett-Sanders, it is my request that this board, as a next step, really consider, we are not ready to vote in 2 weeks. There's a lot here, and I think our public also deserves the right to have better input than what we've seen.
Thank you, Ms. McLaughlin. I would ask you to please also use the next steps as well. Appreciate it. And with that, I have Ms. Sizemore-Heiser.
Just briefly, and I really appreciate first really listening to my colleagues and the conversation. I think there's obviously a lot here, and we're all working very hard to get this right for our community and our staff and our stakeholders. And I appreciate the staff's hard work too in trying to bring something back, taking feedback from a variety of groups. I know this is not easy, and there's never a perfect answer, as Ms. Cohen said. And that's what I wanted to say. I think there's never a perfect calendar, because there's so many different things to balance, and it's hard to, I think, sometimes know exactly how much to balance of each different thing, which is why, for me, the operational challenges are the highest priority, because we need to keep our kids in school, and we need to keep them with good teachers. But I would just say, to me, I agree, Ms. McLaughlin, I think Veterans Day is something that should be looked at. I agree that when we're looking at the data for Orthodox Good Friday, I think there's pieces here to improve this calendar, and I'm on board with working to improve this calendar. But at the end of the day, especially what's happening in our community now, what's happening in the world outside of us, and what many of our surrounding jurisdictions have done to send a message of inclusivity, perfect or not, I think is really important for this board and this school system to send. And that's what I feel like we're doing here. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sizemore-Heiser. Ms. Pekarsky.
Just quickly, I just wanted to say that I appreciate you trying to find some balance with the ode days, because I know those have created lots of difficulty with staff and also with students just not wanting to be in school on those days if there's no new material. So that is definitely not a way to keep students in class. So thank you for that. One of the things that was a big concern of mine last year was just the continuity of weeks where, we are in school Monday to Friday. And I think that is better this year. So that is really important to me. And, you know, back to just briefly what I spoke about, the value, I do see now the value of the regional approach, not that I didn't before, but I mean, and what I'm hearing from my own schools, and their staff and their difficulties, I do want to make sure that I am, you know, being able to support my administrators and my teachers, and we need teachers in class to be able to provide that instruction. And I'll just say that I look forward to the conversations and some of these tweaks, but I do know that you all worked hard because I saw it firsthand, and I know you struggled to kind of find that balance and came back, you know, many times to try to keep us informed. And I just want to say I do appreciate that, and I know this is hard. I know we're all are looking for the perfect. Thank you.
Ms. Omesh.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to follow, actually, Ms. Pekarsky. I think, you know, we'd be remiss to walk away thinking that this was a failure or something. I think there was a lot to juggle here and to bring to the table. And staff did work with us to have conversations in advance to get this right. I think we can't allow perfect to be the enemy of the good. I wanted to stress, when we say intellectual integrity, the point isn't to say that means we need numbers. The point is to say we recognize the limitations of what's available and we make the best of what we've got. So I just want that to be very clear. So then when we think about Veterans Day, I think we also have to weigh all the other stuff. If we're going to open that can of worms, then we say, okay, regionally what's happening, since that's going to be kind of our baseline this time, recognizing it's not perfect. If that's not good enough, then we're going to open up the whole thing with Orthodox holidays, Bodhi Day, Lunar New Year, etc. So I would say that perhaps when we look at that, if staff are going to go back and look at it, if a board member wants to propose an amendment, I think we have to keep in mind that the restriction we put here is regional operational compatibility, and not just recognition of holidays and absenteeism data. And that's really where intellectually we can be rigorous in setting a standard and saying, these are what the numbers show us. In fact, even Veterans Day is not at the top, by the way. I just want to be intellectually accurate here. But there are comparable holidays. If we want to open that door, fine. But otherwise, we're sticking to the regional consensus.
Thank you, Ms. Omesh.
So I just offer that.
Thank
for
you,
our
Ms.
thoughts.
Omesh. Ms. Marin?
Yeah, as we consider that art and science approach, I think would be an interesting exercise to think about when it's beneficial to keep students in school to learn about the day that's being observed. I mean, the cultural and religious observations, you know, obviously would need to be observed outside of the school and the family. But, you know, I even wonder, like, Indigenous Peoples Day, should students be in school that day to learn? And I know our staff has done a lot of work to bring curriculum and teaching around that day, but I feel similarly about Veterans Day. You know, at my own children's school, where there is not a high veteran population, I actually think my kids benefit from being in school and doing the events that, you know, happen by volunteers and with staff. So I think that's an interesting pin to put on in the future.
Thank you, Ms. Marin. Ms. Tolan, do you have a go back? No. Okay, then I will conclude with my remarks and then the end of the session. First, I'm going to encourage everybody to use the next steps. Secondly, regarding the representation on the community groups and who actually participated, I will encourage that given the limitations in that participation, there is no way in the world that I can support this being a 3-year window. It's just not fair because people did not understand what was going on, and it was done in the midst of COVID. Additionally, when we look at neighboring jurisdictions and we look at constituencies, and I'm very sensitive to this because I have the blessing of being able to represent Fort Belvoir in my community, we have over 11,500 students who are children of active duty personnel. That is a significant number, and those students should be recognized. We talk about giving instruction, but as Dr. Ivey knows, this year the instruction didn't go out to all of our schools in a manner that ensured that each one of our schools did the level of recognition to Veterans Day that it should have had. And so knowing when I look at the actual data, the percentage of teachers and staff that take off on Veterans Day, the number of people that are affiliated as staff to the military, and our student absenteeism, that is a significant number that I've, in the past, actually seconded motions for Veterans Day. And given that I use 30 seconds for next steps, I will say, I would like to understand, Dr. Presidio, what a 990-hour calendar would look like. And my reasoning is because I know that that also helps you on professional development. Could you come back to us with something like that?
Yeah, just put your request obviously in the next steps, but just real briefly, I mean, if you go to a 990-hour calendar, what we're saying is we have less flexibility for inclement weather days, right? So there's the opportunity, well, depending on how you address inclement weather days, you might have to make up more of those days at the end of the year if you have a lot of inclement weather days. That's the negative with the 990 calendar.
Okay, thank you. It is now 1:34. I will be putting something in the next steps on that. I'm going to adjourn, and we will reconvene at 2:05 so that we can continue on our calendar, our agenda.